Now, what is new criticism? Modernist revolution in literary criticism was initiated by Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. And Eliot's early essays, you can see, it talks about one which is led by I.A. Richards and F.R. Lewis, and the other which is carried on by the Fugitive Group. And Eliot talks about impersonality in literature, talking about formalist aspects of literature, where they were looking at artwork as autonomous objects of inquiry instead of looking at the historical or the bibliographical details. So instead of looking at an artwork as something, who has written it, what are the context in which the book got published, what is the publication history, or what is the biography of the author, and why is it important to understand the biography of the author in understanding the literature, or even talking about social, in which age it came out, and therefore the social and political issues that the text is talking about. Instead of looking at those aspects of literature, they were mostly interested in poetry as a form, and therefore we find we find that I. Richards, in his Practical Criticism 1929, also talked about how the full meaning of the poem can only be understood by the tone of it, by the symbols used, by the intentions in the message, the feeling of it, the rhythm behind it, instead of looking into the content much. So F.R. Lewis, in New Bearings in English Poetry, also developed Eliot's idea of fusion of thought with feeling. And so literary criticism around the end of 1930s refocused on the text rather than the author, and looking at the text as an autonomous unit instead of the author. And therefore they started with practical criticism, also started with this classroom approach of close reading. So I. Richards and others, they started this kind of literary criticism where the students would be asked to read very closely between the lines, and so the close reading approach, instead of the author's intention, it is actually the reader who would read and understand things which is between the lines or close reading and so on. New criticism again has been blamed for very conservative elitism. T.S. Eliot has been criticized for being very, very anti Semitic ideas, anti Jewish, while the fugitive poets have ignored racism. These are some of the major contributions of the new critics, quite well known contributions. The well wrought on understanding poetry, language as gesture, the world's body, on the limits of poetry, seven types of ambiguity. All these would show that these are mainly ignoring the history, the genres, the biographies, and focused only on the form. New criticism was therefore seen to be a very scientific and very objective approach, but it did not take into consideration social and political context. Yeah, so feminist critics and Marxist critics and post colonial critics were extremely upset with the new critics because they demanded that literature has to be analyzed in order to understand the oppression of women, of minorities, of working class, of blacks, and so on. So you cannot have literature only as to talk about the form, or only to talk about, only to talk about symbols and so on. So you can see the critical tropes used are multiplicity principle, very objective, empirical, systematic, very scientific temperament. Talking about symbols, talking about metaphors, irony, paradox, ambiguity. So one of the examples would be, for instance, just to give you an example, there is Elsie Knight's and criticism of Shakespeare's text as text which is talking about the Shakespeare's play as poetry. only focusing on the poetic aspects or poetic aspects of poem of Shakespeare, and therefore looking at it through either it is through the metaphor of music or the metaphor of tempest and so on. So there is a way in which each of the poems are, each of the texts, whether they are poetry or whether they are drama or any other, they would be looking at it through feelings, phrases, imagery, symbols, metaphors, without going into the other aspects of it. So this I've already discussed.